How many of you saw the debate between Ken Ham and Bill Nye, the science guy? How many of you heard about it? You didn't see it, but you heard about it. How did you feel about that debate? We're among friends. Were you encouraged? Were you wanting more? Did you feel like more could have been done, said, and so on? Well, there's quite a bit of controversy about that, and I just felt like it needs to be commented on, and I'm not saying that my comments are the ones that you need to hear or whatever, but I wanted to address that tonight in a setting that I felt like was a friendly session.
It should have been you, John.
Well, the topic is creation, a viable model of origins in today's world. Absolutely, it is a viable model. Absolutely. Let me ask this group, what in this room got here by chance? Did this room's design occur by chance? The octagonal shape and the diminishing size of the octagons that are shifted a few degrees and stacked up to make a dome, the carpet, the air conditioning, the electricity, the chairs, the furniture, nothing in this room got here by chance. Now, did it? And yet chance is the hero of the plot for evolution, just blind, accidental chance. And they couldn't have a worse starting point. They start with an explosion, a big bang. Explosions tear things up. They destroy things. They don't create things. And so absolutely creation is a viable model in today's world. Now, presenting it to a world that by and large does not accept the authority of the Bible is a challenge for us, is it not? And I'm going to subtitle this, What Coulda, Shoulda, Woulda Been Said. All right? I wish had been said. Now, my observations about the debate for what they're worth. The pressure and tension of a live televised debate is huge. Let me be a little forgiving here. To stand before an international audience, an audience of about 700 or 800 probably live in that auditorium, and knowing that it was being broadcast to 7 million worldwide, Dr. Ball, 7 million people, and it's live. If you've ever been in that setting, perhaps you have tried to talk to someone who is a skeptic just one-on-one across the booth, a table in a booth somewhere, and you know you get a little anxious sometimes. What am I going to say next? You're thinking about what you just said, what you need to say, trying to concentrate on what they're saying so you know how to respond, and it's a pretty good mental exercise, I assure you. So it's not an enviable position. I've been in it a few times, not to that scale, but it's pretty tough. So let's be a little forgiving there, that it is hard. But Bill Nye made it about Ham's model. He continually referred to Ham's model of the world, Ham's model of the universe, of origins. He kept referring to those on the outside, Ken, those on the outside of this building, this creation building, as if to marginalize the creation viewpoint. In other words, he was trying to draw a comparison between the real world. Those on the outside, they know these things. You guys in here, y'all are kind of backwater people, don't really know too much, you know, and so on. I just got that impression as I watched it live at LeTourneau University on a big screen. And another observation was I thought Ham did a good job of comparing and contrasting origin science versus operational science. Let me explain. There's actually two things. Real science, operational science, gives us better automobiles. I mean, isn't it cool that you have a button you can lock and unlock your car? I have one that it raises the back hatch of my car. And we have all kinds of science that's gone into the production of cars. We no longer have two little glass boxes up here with a candle in them for headlights, for heaven's sakes. We've got smart cars now that automatically will brake for you if you don't see something. We've got those that when you're backing up, there's a camera where you can see things. It takes science, operational science, to do that. Origin science is a whole different thing. We love science, and don't ever think that a creationist is anti-science. In fact, as Dr. Ball pointed out in some comments earlier this week, it's the creation scientists that led us out of the dark ages and founded the following branches of science. It's the creationists that led us out of the dark ages. And some of them are still living, like Dr. Raymond Damadian, that has removed a phrase from our lips, thank God. I remember as an early young Christian hearing prayer requests on Sunday morning. Pray for Brother Smith. He's going in for exploratory surgery this week. We don't hear that phrase much anymore because with MRIs and things like that, we can look inside the body without cutting it open. How great a science was that? That's wonderful science. But when you talk about origin science, you're talking about something that supposedly happened millions and millions of years ago. No one was around to see it. There's no eyewitness accounts, no written records of any eyewitness account. You have no photographs. You don't see it happening today on any kind of a scale. That's not real science. It's beyond the realm of observation. It's a metaphysical idea about the unobserved past. It's a metaphysical idea, philosophy about the unobserved past. You don't get something from nothing, and I challenge the evolutionists of this world and this country in particular to move out of the 1800s and get into the 21st century reality and come clean with the public, that you don't get something from nothing. And design does indeed point to a designer. Yes. And I'm not ashamed to say that, and I think it's an obvious fact. So he did a pretty good job of that. However, I think he failed to adequately respond to some of Nye's challenges, and I'd like to address 2 or 3 of those right now. Bill Nye asked him, Ken, show me just one example of a lower life form with higher life forms in the fossil record. Do you remember that challenge? Several times he said it. Ken, just show me one example of a lower life form mixed in with a higher life form. Apparently, Bill Nye thinks that the fossil record is very well sorted, with no exceptions. Truth is, the fossil record has a general trend, but there are many exceptions. For example, you find clams. How about clams? There's a good example. Right there, that's a picture taken on the ledge in Glen Rose, Texas, of a clam right there. I hope you can see it. We're running into some right now. They're a little bit better than that, actually. And so I'm going to upgrade this picture. But these are in the same layer of rock with dinosaurs, which they would say, well, they're pretty high up on the so-called geologic column, which incidentally doesn't exist anywhere in the world except in textbooks. That's right. Now, textbooks are supposed to reflect reality. The geologic column of those layers does not exist anywhere in the world. In fact, no more than 3 of those layers appear in only about 15% of the Earth's land surface. When we look at the fossil layers of the Earth, as you go through a road cut, some of you probably go through road cuts on the way home from here, where they've cut the road through a hill so it didn't go like a roller coaster on you, it's more level. You can see those layers. They're very parallel, meaning they were laid down quickly. Folks, there was a global flood. There's evidence at every road cut. And there are millions of dead things, billions, buried in those rock layers. And those rock layers were once sedimentary sediment. And so you have clams on the bottom. Next, clams, like John Morris says, clams still alive. You've got them all through the column. It is not a real clean, neat textbook exhibition, as apparently Bill Nye thinks it is. And so you want some examples of lower life forms in with higher life forms. How about these clams? How about these right here, also taken from the Paluxy? Clams all over the place. Now, I respect the fact that Ken Ham holds the Bible in such high regard, and his approach has wonderful results among believers. However, when you're going to try to win the world, which the majority is not there yet, my Bible says, narrow is the way and straight is the gate that leads to eternal life, and few there be that find it, few. But broad is the way that leads to destruction, and many there be that go in thereat. So I hear the word few and many. Don't ever worry about the fact if you're not in the majority. In fact, I'd worry if you were in the majority. You know, nowhere in Scripture was the majority ever right. But anyway, how about the cat tracks that are in the same limestone layer with dinosaurs? They should be separated by many, many more years. An example of lower life form with a higher life form, and I put that in quotes and so forth. And Ken Ham, while he is very good on promoting the reliability of Scripture, that's a message that resonates with Christian audiences. And Jesus himself set a pattern for us on evidence, and it should not be shunned. There was once a man who had great doubts about the resurrection. His name was Thomas. And he came to Jesus, and what was Jesus' response to that man, that skeptic? He didn't say, shame on you, you should believe what the Scriptures say. He could have said it, but he said what? Thomas, come here. Put your hand in my palm and in my side. And Thomas did that, And he said, my Lord and my God, game over, case closed, I'm a believer. All it took was that little bit of evidence. That's all it takes for a lot of people. Just give me that little nugget. And Ken doesn't like that approach, and his spokespeople have told me on the phone, as I've offered evidence for the magazine, well, we really are nervous about evidence. And I said, why? Well, because if someone's faith is built on a fossil or an artifact or something like that, that later we find out was misinterpreted or fabricated, faked, whatever, then what's that going to do to their faith? I said, well, it might shake it, but in the meantime, they've been a believer and they've seen other evidences. Yes. And first off, that's going to be a very rare occurrence. Yes. It's going to be a very rare occurrence. You can't fool people that easily. And I'm not saying it couldn't ever happen, but how's that working for you? How's that working for you, that approach? Not so good, I don't think. And here's paw pads that have been cross-sectioned and so on of this big cat. Here's 2 trilobites found in Glen Rose limestone layers. And we have a museum called Creation Evidence Museum. That drew me here because I'm all about evidence. As a mathematician, there's not a lot of room for fuzzy stuff. I mean, we think 2 plus 2 is 4. You know, there's people who probably think it's 5. But we just got the evidence. Give me 4 pennies and I'll show you. You know, and so in the same layer of limestone, 2 trilobites found, similar to these, along with 2 major dinosaurs. This has an assigned evolutionary age of about 540 million years. That's an early life form, according to him. However, there's 3 lobes, segmented body, compound eyes. Not really so simple, after all. In with 2 major dinosaurs, assigned evolutionary age of 110 million, with the same layer of the big cat track, an assigned evolutionary age of 16 million, along with over 90 human footprints that are modern. So the evidence is certainly there, Bill Nye. Take a look. How about in the country of Colombia? An ammonite in with what appear to be human hand bones, or maybe what they think is our closest relative, an ape. That doesn't help their case much. It's certainly next to the highest life form, in with one from way down below. I think we've got the evidence. And they don't have to come to Glen Rose to get it. There's plenty of evidence out there. They have magazines that have some of it in there. Here's a world-famous Taylor Trail, documented by David Lyons. I've got his overhead view of that in my full session and so on, crossed by dinosaur tracks and so on, higher life form with lower. It's there. And what about this one? The shoe print in the lobby of the Creation Evidence Museum. A sandal print or a shoe print of some kind with the heel line, stepping on a trilobite. Alleged age 540 million years, humans, modern times. A very clear trilobite. Tell them the species, Dr. Ball.
Elrathia gingai.
Elrathia gingai. It's like finding not a dog fossil, but we found a peekapoo. Mm-hmm. We even know what his haircut was like. You know, I mean, that's how specific it is. I think the evidence is there. Another thing that he hammered Ken Ham on was tree ring dating. And so I began to do a little bit of research on that. ICR, there's some wonderful scholars at the Institute for Creation Research in Dallas. And they had some good articles here. I read it, underlined it. I had more things underlined than not underlined. And just trying to summarize it. Another example was about tree ring dating. Nye's claim that some tree has 9,500 rings, which he says, obviously the Earth is at least that old. Not so fast. Many factors affect the rate of ring formation, and the common notion that a ring indicates a year of growth is often incorrect, as indicated by the ICR article by Dr. John Morris. For one, you've got winter and summer rings, and then there's a lot of other things. Here's another one of their very fine scholars, Dr. Brian Thomas at ICR. And do tree rings disprove the Genesis chronology? And given the wild climate swing since the Ice Age, there's every reason to expect that extra rings in trees that began growing soon after the flood. Extra rings. And some of the factors include the length of daylight. Now, we just finished the longest sunlight day of the year, June 21st. The amount of sunshine, how intense it is, the water potential, the soil nutrients, the age of the tree, the temperatures, the rainfall, the height above the ground. I mean, the thing grows kind of in a tapered fashion. Proximity to a branch, and how those rings morph over into the branch and so forth. All affect the rate of tree ring growth. And so here is a quote, "All trees, even slow-growing ones, respond dynamically to tiny environmental changes." I didn't know that forestry people have sensors on trees, and they monitor them every 15 minutes in some cases. And they have some pretty amazing things to report that happen very dynamically in these trees. Even hourly changes in growing conditions. Scientists have observed that numerous normal conditions can produce an extra ring or no ring at all. Unusual storms with abundant rainfall interspersed with dry periods can produce multiple rings, essentially one per major storm. Well, there you go. The basic assumption of tree ring dating is demonstrably in error. That's from the Brian Thomas article. And the years that followed the flood were marked by the coming ice age, warm oceans, greater evaporation, monsoon-type rains, snowfall in the northern latitudes, rainfall in the south. If ever there were conditions for multiple tree rings per year, it was during those centuries. Thus, far from disproving biblical history, tree ring studies provide supportive and instructional information about true history. And these are from true scholars. This right here is the bristlecone pine tree. There's a whole grove of these in the White Mountains of Northern California. American Forestry Association was at 4,600 years of age. And one of the things that Bill Nye said was, "Ken Ham, how can the plants live underwater for a year? You're saying the whole earth was covered with water." That's not the scenario that we are saying happened. We think that the vegetation was pretty much denuded from the land, scrubbed off of the land. It wasn't like, oh, the water just slowly bubbled up around these trees. It wasn't that at all. Look at what one tsunami wave will do. But we do propose that there were floating log mats in numerous places, and little seedlings, and seeds and seedlings could have survived for a year in those conditions, and evidently did. And then when the floodwaters receded, they get deposited and they got all the peat moss there with them. So it's pretty good planting. Here's a funny little thing about the world's oldest tree. All these different dates on here, and kid over here playing with his cell phone, playing games, and he's put a sign on there, "We leave on this stupid family vacation on this day." You know, Dad's all very funny. Another thing that he was hammered about was ice cores and seafloor sediments and the age of the earth, particularly the ice core. And another challenge was concerning this, that there were ice cores counted with 680,000 layers. So how could the earth not be at least that old? Well, the real facts are, he was referring to the GISP-2 core, and I've forgotten exactly where that is, if it's in the North Pole or the South Pole. But here's the facts. They only counted 15% of that core. Only 110,000 cores were counted, rings, and they were near the bottom of the core, 110,000 rings, and they were near the bottom of the core. That's a significant fact. To extrapolate that there's 680,000. Here's one of the scholars of Ice Age, Michael Ord, you know of him, and Dr. Larry Vardaman, also at ICR, Carl Whelan. Cold comfort for long agers, and so on. In this article I ran across and pulled it off the web. It's very important to understand that most of these alleged annual layers are concentrated in the bottom several hundred meters of the core, and their interpretation as annual is very questionable. Annual layers cannot be derived from ice cores drilled on top of the Antarctic ice sheet, since the snowfall rate, less than 5 centimeters of water per year, is too light for annual layer dating. The world's renowned expert on ice cores, Michael Ord, said that. And creationists have an alternative interpretation in which the post-flood rapid ice age caused very thick annual layers during the ice age, followed by a decrease to the current annual snowfall of today. And so I just want to say, IMHO, you know what that is, right? You text people? In my humble opinion. In my humble opinion. In my humble opinion, layers in ice cores correspond to storms, blizzards, and other weather conditions on an almost daily basis, and has been misinterpreted as representing long ages. I think that's what's going on there. And here's Michael Ord's book, The Frozen Record, examining the ice core history of the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets. He says, of course, the snowfall rate is much less at the top of the high ice sheet today. However, even at the current average snowfall for the whole Greenland ice sheet, it still would take only 5,000 years to deposit all the ice, about the time since the flood. And so that's good enough for me. And there's some references. And finally, Bill Nye asked Kim Ham why there were no kangaroo fossils along the way to Australia. He was trying to explain, Ken was, how they came off the Ark in the Ararat region and made their way across land bridges because the ocean was much lower at that time. And that's another topic, and it's easily verifiable. And he said, well, how come there's no, and he knew that that was what he said, what his view was. And so he said, how come there's no kangaroo fossils along the way from Ararat to Australia? So as to disprove the biblical dispersion concept. And I said right here, I wish Ken would have given the answer he wrote in one of his answers books. This would have been an excellent time to show a logical biblical answer. Would you like to see it? Actually, marsupial animals like kangaroos that have a pouch for their newborn infant to stay in could have made the trip much quicker than placental animals that have to wait till the litter gets old enough to make the journey. You follow me? And so it's actually very logical. And they could have made the trip from the Ark's resting place much quicker than other mammals. The newborns had their mother's pouch to ride in instead of having to wait. And kangaroos arrived before most of them, in my view. Lions once lived in Israel. But guess what? We find no lion fossils there. What's the absence of fossils supposed to indicate? Nothing. You don't know if... That doesn't really say what he was trying to make the case for. And... Bill Nye's kangaroo argument was weak and should have been exposed. Fossil formation requires special flood conditions. They're not going to just die on the trail going to Australia and make a fossil, any more than your backyard pet dies and makes a fossil, any more than roadkill dies and makes a fossil. You've got to have special conditions. You've got to have sudden death, sudden burial, and sudden pressure. You've got to be buried in mud so that scavengers can't smell the carcass and will leave it alone. And so the fossilization can begin to have a chance to occur, depending on the mineralization of the mud. And while the battle is ultimately the Lord's, creation museums and ministries are essential to help us fulfill 1 Peter 3:15, to quote, be able to give a defense of the faith and show this world that the Bible has the most trustworthy answers. Now, I want to give you a sobering thought. Bill Nye, science guy, says he underestimated the debate's impact. Now, church, I have 3 more slides I want to show you, and this is very sobering. It matters what you believe. It matters what you believe. I have kind of a sad story. What you're seeing is a picture of Richard Dawkins, the world's most vocal evolutionist, I would say. And he wrote a book called The God Delusion. And I want to tell you the story of a 22-year-old young man named Jesse Kilgore who committed suicide. And it's very sad because this was a very dynamic Christian young man, and he was actually very vocal in his faith and was a good debater and all of that. And WorldNet Daily released this. This was back in 2008, but not much. I haven't seen much about it in creation circles, so I want you to know about it. And it says, a New York man is linking the suicide of his 22-year-old son, a military veteran who had bright prospects in college, to the anti-Christian book, The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins, after a college professor challenged his son to read it. 3 people told us he had taken a biology class and was doing well in it, but other students and the professor were really challenging my son, his faith. They didn't like him as a Republican, as a Christian, and as a conservative who believed in intelligent design. The grief-stricken father, Keith Kilgore, told WorldNet Daily about his son, Jesse. This professor either assigned him to read or challenged him to read a book, The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins. Jesse committed suicide in October by walking into the woods near his New York home and shooting himself. The father, Keith Kilgore, said he was shocked because he believed his son was grounded in Christianity. He had blogged against abortion and for family values and boasted he'd been debating for years. And after Jesse's death, Keith Kilgore, the father, learned of the book assignment from 2 of his son's friends and a relative. He searched Jesse's room and found the book under the mattress with his son's bookmark on the last page. Another friend at the funeral told me the same thing. Keith Kilgore said this guy was his best friend, about the only other Christian on campus, and so forth. And so that relative who struggled with his own faith and had returned to Christianity wrote later an email that Jesse started to tell me about his loss of faith in everything. He was pretty much an atheist with no belief in the existence of God in any form or an afterlife, or even the concept of right or wrong, the relative wrote. I remember him telling me that he thought that murder wasn't wrong per se, and so on. He'd never do it because of social consequences and so forth. And he mentioned the book he had been reading, The God Delusion, and how it, along with the science classes he had taken, had eroded his faith, and so on and so forth. And so that's pretty much it, but I wanted to bring out one more paragraph. The father said, I'm all for academic freedom, but what I do have a problem with is if there's going to be academic freedom, there has to be an academic balance. They were undermining every moral and spiritual value for my son. They ought to be held accountable. He said, there's another thing. If my son was a professing homosexual and a professor challenged him to read a book called Preventing Homosexuality, if my son was gay and the book made him feel bad, hopeless, and he killed himself, and that came out in the press, there'd be an outcry. He would have been a victim of a hate crime, and the professor would have been forced to undergo sensitivity training, and there may have even been a wrongful death lawsuit. But because he's a Christian, I don't even get a return telephone call, the father told WorldNet Daily. He said he tried to verify the book assignment himself several times without getting a response from the school. It matters what you believe, church.